read about a couple of guys who were late to the church potluck dinner. And they got there at the same time, and both of them noticed the dessert table. Only two desserts left, a big piece of pie and a small piece of pie. So they rushed to the table, but of course one of them got there first, got the big piece of pie. Well, the other guy was very upset. And the first guy noticed it, and he says, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, you got the big piece of pie." He said, "Well, what would you have done?" "Well, I would have gotten the small piece of pie." "Why are you so upset? You got the small piece of pie." We all want the big piece. There's something about our nature, the Bible calls it a sinful nature, that is selfish. We want our way to be done. And as I've said in your handout there in your bulletin, Jesus confronted the disciples at a time they were arguing over who's chief, who's the greatest in the kingdom. And they weren't talking about anybody out there, they were talking about in here. Which one of us is the greatest? And in Matthew 18, Jesus is recorded in verse 2 as saying, calling a child to him, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And whoever humbles himself like this child, he's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus confronts these arguing disciples over, they're arguing and debating who's the greatest, puts a little child there, and he cites the example of a child. Now understand, they were already being like a child in the negative sense of the term, described by the word childish. Jesus is suggesting that when we learn from the little ones, like children, we are to view them from the perspective of childlike. You see, to be childish is to be selfish. To be childlike is to be generous. To be childish is to be proud. To be childlike is to be humble. To be childish is to be skeptical. To be childlike is to be trusting. To be childish is to be phony. To be childlike is to be real. To be childish is to be jealous. But to be childlike is to be sharing. To be childish is to be demanding. To be childlike is to be accepting. To be childish is to be repressive. To be childlike is to be submissive. To be childish is to be hateful. To be childlike is to be loving. To be childish is to be vengeful. To be childlike is to be forgiving. And so as we learn from children, as we celebrated, as Janice said, a wonderful week of Bible school, we teach them during Bible school, but can they teach us? Can little ones teach us? Jesus says, of course, they can. So looking at this example that Jesus gives us, what can we learn from the little ones? Well, first of all, we need to learn that being like a child, childlikeness is what the term I use, requires a total sense of dependence. Some of you, I bet, have been here. I don't know if you recognize this slide. This is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Have you been there? I bet you some of you have been there when you went to Israel. All right. You will notice this is the main entrance. By the way, the Church of the Nativity is the oldest church in Christendom. It was the very first church. Now, we didn't build buildings till the 4th century, and that was the first one. It is built over where the church believed Jesus was born. Well, originally it had a great big door, but look at it now. You see what happened? It was built in the 4th century, but in the, the 11th, 12th century, when the Crusaders came in, the Crusaders would ride their horses into the church. So the church authorities lowered the wall so they had to get off their high horse. Ever heard that phrase? And not only would they have to get off the horse, they would have to stoop down. The idea was when the wise men came to the birth of Jesus, did they bow down before him? And so this church is a parable, as it were, to say, folks, when we come to Jesus, we must humble ourselves. You see, a little child knows it is dependent upon mom and dad. How dependent? Well, let me ask you this. When Jesus said you must be born again, question for you, what does a child do to cause its birth? A child can't do anything. It's impossible. And so Jesus is saying to these disciples, guys, I'm going to tell you something. The way you're acting, let me tell you something, you won't even get into the kingdom, much less lead it, because the attitude you have of arrogance and selfishness keeps you out. The only way you can be saved, become a Christian, go to heaven, is you got to humble yourself and admit that you are helpless. I remember just this week, a pastor talked about a fellow pastor of his. Alan Snapp said a fellow pastor of his had a great offer from one of his church members. The church member was taking his family to Disneyland and went to the pastor and says, we'd like you to come along and join us. And he said this, I'll pay all your expenses. You and your family, I'll pay it all. But there is a condition. Here's what he said to his pastor. If you pay for anything, you will pay for everything. That's what he said. If you buy a Coca-Cola, you pay for the whole trip. He says, I'm going to pay it all or nothing. That's what Jesus says. The minute any of you try to say to Jesus, oh, Jesus, I want to go to heaven. Let me see if I can pull out a good work here, baptism, or, I'll go to church, I'll tithe. Cancels the whole deal. Jesus paid it all or nothing. A little child doesn't say to mom and dad when they give them a Christmas, oh, mom and dad, let me. No, they just take it. All right, what else? To learn like a child, childlikeness requires unselfish deference. Now, Jesus did answer their question. They said, who's the greatest? The first thing he said, as I've just indicated, is, I tell you what, guys, you don't even get into the kingdom unless you humble yourself, stop acting like you're acting right now. But then he did answer their question. Okay, question is, okay, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? So here's what he said. Truly verse number 4, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Did you hear that? How do you get into the kingdom? You got to be like a little child. You got to humble yourself. Well, how do you become great in the kingdom? You got to be like a little child. Have you ever noticed how there are people who will, when they accept Christ, they'll come down to the altar and they're bowing, maybe crying, oh God, forgive me. They humble themselves at the altar. But then once they get in, I want to take over. Have y'all noticed that? I've seen people who we say, and all this, that, and the other, join the church. Next thing you know, they want to run the church. Jesus says that's not how it works. You remember John, we've already talked about this in one of our services. I've already talked about the fact that Jesus, by the way, these disciples, they're like some students that I've had. They just don't seem to learn very well. So he taught them here. Well, it happened again. They were fussing in who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus overheard that. And according to John, you know what he did? He didn't say anything that time. He just got up, took off his outer garment, put on a towel, and washed their feet. The one thing no teacher could ask any student to do is what he did. He was talked about being a servant. And that's what he was. And he said, hey guys, you forgot. You want to be chief in the kingdom? You wash feet. Humble yourself. And then another time here in Matthew, sometimes it's not just the kids. Sometimes the parents want their kids to be greatest in the kingdom. And so James and John's mom came to Jesus and said, Jesus, when you get to come to your kingdom, could my son sit on your right and left hand? Well, Jesus responded to her, but then he went on right after that and said in verse 25, he called all the disciples together. He said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. The rulers out there in the world's philosophy of leadership is take charge, be in power. But it shall not be among you. Whoever would want to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever will be first among you must be your slave. He actually used the word slave. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jesus says to these disciples over and over as they were debating about who could be in charge and all this kind of stuff, he says, guys, listen to me. The only way you can lead in God's kingdom is by serving. In God's kingdom, leaders take orders. They don't give orders. One of the saddest, there's been many, but one of the saddest, because both these guys, I admire both of them, Luther and Zwingli in the Reformation. Anyhow, get this. The followers of Zwingli and the followers of Luther were literally at war. I don't mean just debating, I mean they were killing each other, fighting at war. One day Zwingli, who lived in Switzerland, was walking in the Alps. You heard this? He was walking in the Alps on a narrow mountain path when he looked up and saw high above him two mountain goats, one coming down the path, the other going up. Well, on one side a steep mountain, on the other side a cliff, a drop-off, very narrow path. So he watched these goats and he saw them come together and then back off. And Zwingli said, oh boy, they're going to charge butt heads and one of them's going to die or maybe both. So he saw as they backed away. Then Zwingli looked up there and here they come back together, and the goat on the lower part of the path knelt down and allowed the goat on the upper part to walk over his back. And both were saved. Was God trying to tell something to Ulrich Zwingli about how to stop wars among Christians? A little child, humble yourself. Something else, childlikeness requires strong discipline. Now, folks, have you ever heard somebody ask, well, I mean, how important is this, Jesus? I mean, how do you really feel about this? Jesus says, I'll tell you what, guys, let me tell you how strongly I feel about being like a child. He says in verse 5, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it'd be better for him to have a millstone fast to his neck, for him to be drowned in the sea. Now, we have to understand, and forgive all this technical stuff, but here in the ESV, causes one to sin is actually one word in the Greek text. I bet you've heard it, scandaliste. Transliterated, take the letters of the Greek into English, you have the word scandal. He literally is saying, whoever scandalizes one of these little ones deserves to be executed. Well, that's a transliteration, but the translation, the literal translation is stumbling stone, stumbling block. Here's the picture. In ancient times, the houses were built right on the street. They didn't have any lawns or anything. They were built right on the street. So when the builder is building the house, he puts the blocks together. But if one of the blocks doesn't fit, he just tosses over his shoulder and it falls out in the street. And he leaves it there. Well, that night, somebody comes walking down the street, no lights, and trip over what should have been a building block. Now it's a stumbling block. And so the picture in the Bible, Peter talks about this in his letter. He warns us, those of us who are supposed to be building blocks in the church that God uses to build up the church, he says, hey, you be careful, don't you become a scandal. In so doing, and by the way, the actual translation most of the time for scandalizte is the word offend. Offend. Now, when we think about a scandal in a church, I've seen it so many times, we think about, the pastor had an affair with somebody, or the pastor embezzled money, or something like that. What's the scandal that's going on here? Fighting over who's in charge. Debating. Arguing. Can arguing be a scandal in a church? Can the way we behave in a business meeting cause people to stumble over us? How do you feel about that, Jesus? Well, the first thing is, he really rubs it in. He's hard. He says it's better for you to be drowned. Now, you have to understand the background, the culture. The Jews had a horrible fear of water. In fact, in Revelation, John said when he saw heaven, he didn't see any water. Now, I want to see beaches in heaven, but not John. Of course, he was exiled. But the Jews looked upon water as chaos. Remember the waters in creation? Chaos, horrible. They're terrified of it. Jews didn't have navies. They depended on the Phoenicians for that. They hated water. But all Jesus had to say to make his point is, it'd be better for you to have your hands tied behind your back and be thrown in the Mediterranean Sea and drown. He didn't do that. He said, it'd be better for you to have a millstone fastened around your neck and then be tossed in the sea. Now, you've heard the word millstone in Greek. Let me just, moulos, anikos. Anikos is the word for stone. Moulos. What would a moulos be? A mule. Two kinds of stone. You had the little stone you could turn with hand. But then you had the mule stone, meaning a stone so big that only a mule could turn it. So, does Jesus use hyperbole or what? He said, I'm telling you guys, stop this. If you don't, it'd be better for you to have a huge mule stone tied to your neck and you drown than to cause someone to be offended, to stumble over you. He's not through. He says in verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. Better for you to enter life crippled or maimed, or lame with two hands and 2 feet, be thrown into eternal fire. And then he says about your eye, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Better than that to be drowned into the lake of fire. He's simply saying this. Followers of mine, do whatever it takes to control yourself. Do whatever it takes to behave in such a way as you not become a scandal and cause a stumbling block and cause people to, I apologize right up front, but why do I? Because what has Jesus just said? But years ago I heard a terrible story about a boy who had cancer, teenage boy, had cancer, and he was on his deathbed. So he called his dad in and said, Dad, I know I don't have long. I've got one last request to make of you. And the father said, Son, anything you say, I'll do it. He said, Dad, I know I don't have long, but don't bury me in a cemetery. I want to be buried right here at home. In fact, he said, I want to be buried right up by the front gate of the farm. So that every day when you go out and when you come in, you'll pass by my grave. And he said, I want you to put a tombstone on that grave, and I want you to have these words, and I want you to read it every time you go out and every time you come in. Okay, son, what do you want on there? He said, Dad, I want you to put the words on there. Here lies a boy who died and went to hell, who never heard his father pray. Your reaction to that story is like the one the disciples would have had what he just said. Guys, don't you dare keep acting like this. People will stumble over you. Well, let's end on a much bitter note. What is it like to be childlike? I just love this. Childlikeness requires unconditional devotion. Now, put this in perspective, and if anybody has an issue coming, because the scholars, they talk about this all the time, and it increases my confidence in Scripture. Remember now, we have 4 Gospels. We believe Mark was first, and it's obvious Matthew is following Mark's lead on this, except Matthew adds something that Mark doesn't add. Matthew puts a parable right after this. We believe, we know it was at least 30 and probably more like 40 years after Jesus' ascension that Matthew wrote his gospel. And by that time, these kinds of scandals are already going on. Christians were fussing among each other, etc. And they were offending people. But here's what happened. They were twisting Jesus' application to what he had just said here. Jesus said, to keep yourself from offending anybody, cut off your hand, this kind of stuff. Well, as time passed by, they began to cut off, all right, but they cut off people who had been offended. In other words, somebody would be offended, and they would leave the fellowship, and the attitude was, good riddance. And Jesus, or Matthew, is confronting that by saying, no. What happens if somebody is offended? It's going to happen. Because we're all human. You know, I've done it, how many times have I had to apologize for some stupid thing I've said or done? When that happens, what do? Well, verse 10, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 who never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Do you hear that? And so Matthew is saying through this wonderful parable, you know what our task is? We're to love the little ones. Yes, we learn from them, but sometimes little ones, some of you parents know this happens. Sometimes little ones go astray. Sometimes little ones run away. Sometimes little ones do not practice what we've taught them. So what do? You may have heard this wonderful story. It happened years ago up in Scotland, where the sheep farmers would send their sheep out to graze. And then, as you know, the culture back then, and Lloyd John Ogilvie was actually there one time and saw this happen. He said it's just a beautiful, beautiful scene. But in the evening, the shepherds would go out there and they'd start calling their sheep. You see, each shepherd had a distinct call for his own sheep. And as Jesus said in other places, the sheep recognize the voice of their own shepherd. So the shepherds would go out there and they'd call the sheep. Well, this one shepherd had a daughter, and she loved to go out with him because she just loved to hear her dad call the sheep and to watch them come to her dad and then follow him to the fold. That went on through her childhood. But unfortunately, as she grew up, she began to rebel against her father's godly teachings, and she ran away down to London. He thought he would hear from her, but he didn't. Months passed, years passed. He never heard from his daughter. He was terribly concerned about what had happened to her. So he thought he'd go looking for her. Okay, so he goes down to London. Now, this is late 19th century. He didn't have cell phones, couldn't Google anything back then. How is he going to find his daughter? Well, you guessed it. He walks up and down the streets of London calling the sheep. He ignored the stares and the glares and the giggles of all the people as they looked at him, or what he was doing. He didn't care what they thought. He cared for his daughter, so he just Day after day, he walked up and down this huge metropolis of London calling sheep. And one day, in a second-floor dilapidated room in an old hotel, a rundown hotel, a young woman whose life had been broken by living on the street, selling her body to men, had a gun in her hand. And she's about to use it when she heard an unbelievable sound. She'd remember it anywhere. She couldn't believe it, tears in her eyes, put down the gun, ran outside into the arms of her shepherd, her father. You see, folks, childlikeness is not just to serve like Jesus, it's to sound like him too. We use his voice. And we say to all of those wandering ones, lost sheep, hey, come on back. We love you. Come to the shepherd. Isn't that right? Well, let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for being our shepherd. Thank you for loving us as sheep. And yes, so many of us, I have, you know I have. I confess it in front of all these people. I've wandered away, and there have been times I've wandered far away. Thank you that you never gave up on me. And thank you, Lord, that you never give up on anybody. There's nobody too lost that they can't be found. And Father, help us to be the same way. Help us never to give up, never to take no for a final answer, and to keep seeking, reaching out. And yes, Lord, help us to be like children in the sense that we humble ourselves before you. That we don't demand the big piece of pie. In fact, we don't demand anything. We just say, here am I, Lord, send me. Now, in a moment, I'll close this prayer time, and we'll have our invitation. I never know what God may have said to you today. He may have placed someone on your heart that you need to go seek and to call back. I don't know. Maybe it's a former member of this church. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's been a long time since you've seen them. But you feel the need to reach out. Maybe someone here today who says, you know what, I've never humbled myself and walked through that humble door of salvation. I guarantee you, don't want to turn down this gift. It's free. You can't do anything to pay for it. Just say, Jesus, thank you for dying for me. Forgive my sins and give me eternal life. Maybe someone else feeling the call of God to come and be a servant here in this place. We need you. We'd love for you to come be a part. I simply ask that you listen to the Lord and say, Father, what are you telling me to do? And that's what I ask right now in prayer, Jesus. Speak to us and show us your will. In your name, amen. All right, let's stand together. And Aaron will lead us in our invitation. And again, the altar is open. If the Lord calls,